Cameras 101, frame rates, shutter speeds, aperture, and the DSLR. So before we get going too deep into cameras and how they work and what we're doing and what buttons to press, I want to go over very, very briefly the history of the film camera. I spent too much time on this morning, so I'm going to do this very, very fast so that you have just a rough history, a rough outline. I think it's important, especially in the film industry, to understand what came before, because we're built upon all the technology that arrived before us. It's important that we understand how we arrived to this point and how we developed the technology that we have. I think it's important to recognize the work and the successes and the failures of the people that came before us. So, history of the film camera. The first film camera, the first camera known to man, was in ancient prehistoric times, caveman times, in which our ancestors painted mastodons on the cave walls, and they'd paint one mastodon over here, and then they'd paint another mastodon over here, and it'd be slightly different. And then the caveman would look at one, and then he'd look at the other really fast. And that, to the caveman, was a moving picture. And that was the very first moving pictures that we ever had in the world of the film industry, the moving mastodons on the wall. But they actually do have, I'm joking a little bit, but they actually do have paintings of cave paintings of animals and people and stuff that are in like varying states of movement. And the archaeologists actually think that this was sort of a primitive, like moving picture kind of thing to tell a story. So in a lot of ways, this really was the predecessor to the cameras that we have today. We have something that developed later called the camera obscura. This is a natural phenomenon. It's really kind of cool. You should Google it and look it up, because I'm not going to spend any real time talking about it. But basically, this is like the pinhole camera, in which light passes through like a tiny little hole and then projects something. Maybe you've done this with like a solar eclipse, for example. Like if you ever looked at a solar eclipse, you know you're not supposed to look directly at the solar eclipse, right? But you might have punched like a little hole or something, like a pinhole projector. And then it projects, and you can see the eclipse like projected on the inside of like a box or something like that. That's one rough way of explaining a camera obscura. We had shadow puppets in around 200 BC. People were making shadow puppets and moving puppets around. Kind of a predecessor to the film, right? To the film camera, right? We had magic lanterns in the 1600s. These were basically just like almost like early projectors. So I actually have one in my classroom. If we were here, I would break it out and I'd show you. My mother gave me this magic lantern for Christmas one year. She found it at an antique shop. Mine's not from the 1600s. Mine you can actually plug into the wall. But mine's from like, I think the early 1900s. I think it's like 1903 or something like that. And it's kind of cool. It's basically a projector. It's like before there were slide projectors, before there were movie projectors, there were these magic lanterns that would cast light and project light, and then you could cast shadows or images. That was sort of a predecessor to the camera. After that, we had phanactoscopes and zoetrope flip books. Maybe you've seen like wheels, like animated wheels, where you draw like a picture and then you draw it around the wheel and you spin the wheel, and then the picture moves. Our current freestyle animation students actually make these in class. It's pretty cool. But you probably made a flip book. How many of you have made a flip book, like with Post-it notes or before you're bored in class and you draw the little stick man running around, right? Okay, I've done it. We've all done it, right? Okay, so flip books. This was an early predecessor to the film camera, okay? Chronophotography is basically just photography done in succession, rapid succession. So they did this oftentimes to study movement. There was a famous case that was proved here around Stanford where they wanted to see if the horse's feet actually all left the ground at the same time. Maybe you've heard about this story before, where they made a bet about, no, I think the horse's one foot's always on the ground, or no, at some point there is the horse is not touching the ground. And they use chronophotography to prove, I believe, that yes, the horse's feet do all leave the ground at some point. And that was, back in the late 1800s, until finally we arrived at the film camera. Early film was shot on 35 millimeter, 16 millimeter. We still shoot predominantly on those size films today, but other film sizes as well. And that leads us to the modern times, the modern motion pictures. They really just are pictures moving fast. That's all it is. It's just picture after picture after picture after picture after picture. That's how motion pictures are made. That's how moving pictures are made. It's all based on this this phenomenon called the phi phenomenon. And the phi phenomenon suggests that if you move a picture at a minimum of 12 times every second, then it'll create the illusion of movement. So even though the picture is just a picture and it's not actually moving, it'll create the illusion of movement if you move it at a minimum of 12 pictures per second, 12 frames per second. Thomas Edison, who's had a huge hand in creating the film camera, suggested a minimum of 46 pictures for every second. Early films, silent films, if you watch in film history and stuff like that, early films actually varied a lot because the cameras were all cranked by hand. So the frame rate, the number of pictures every second, would depend on how quickly or how slow the camera operator was moving the film through the camera. And then you'd take that finished film and you take it over to like a movie house or a movie theater, and they'd have a projector, and it was the same kind of deal. You didn't know how fast their projector was going to play it back. Sometimes it was faster, sometimes it was slower. You just didn't really know. So the early films, their frame rates, their pictures for every second were all over the place and varied. There was no standardized number of, no, it's this many pictures for every second. So here's a picture of the phi phenomenon. It doesn't look good to you because we're on Zoom, but I'm going to try sharing this. Hang on a second. So I'm going to try, if I do this, maybe you'll be able to see it a little bit better. There we go. Yeah, that looks good. So here you have an image. This is just an image. This is a GIF or a GIF if you prefer. I think it's a GIF. That's my official vote on the matter. But this is just an image, and each circle is lighting up and disappearing, but it's happening in succession. So it looks like the circle's kind of spinning. It looks like it's spinning. It's not actually. It's just an image, but that's what's going on. So it's kind of cool. That's called the phi phenomenon. Which brings us to frame rates. So this idea of taking pictures, a certain number of pictures every second, is called a frame rate, or frames per second. We call it FPS sometimes. If you ever see that in the film world, FPS, that stands for frames per second, the number of pictures that's being taken every single second of film. You've probably heard in the film industry, maybe if you watched cartoons or if you watch Disney movies, you've probably heard that movies are 24 frames every second. If you're an animator at Disney, you have to draw 24 pictures for every second. That's true. That's true if you are doing a full-fledged motion picture like that. So this idea, this frame rate, is just that. It's just the number of pictures for every second. However, when we started adding sound in the world of film history in the late 1920s, 1927, 1928, somewhere around there, sound started to be brought into the film world. And now, all of a sudden, when you added sound into the film world, all of a sudden now your frame rate mattered, and it needed to be consistent because we had to line up our sound. If we had people talking, we needed to sync it up with their mouths. And if the frame rate was changing all the time, the sound would speed up or slow down. And if you ever sped up or slowed down your voice, it sounds really weird, right? It gets really low or slow, or it gets really fast and you sound like a chipmunk. So when they started adding sound, they realized we needed to have a standardized frame rate, a consistent frame rate that everyone was using, whether they were recording or whether they were playing something back like in a movie house. Okay, so they need to come up with a standardized frame rate. They decided on 24 frames per second. And they decided on this number because it was divisible by a lot of different numbers. It's divisible by 6, divisible by 4, divisible by 8, divisible by 3. It was double the phi phenomenon, right? So the phi phenomenon says you need a minimum of 12 in order to make it look like it's moving, in order to have that illusion of movement. So this is twice that. So that's cool. And if you double it, it's close to Edison's recommended 46. They didn't want to do Edison's 46. They thought that was too much. But if you played it back 2 frames, if they doubled it, then you could get that 46 that Edison recommended. Ultimately, one of the major reasons why the film industry settled on 24 frames per second is because it was cheaper. It was a lot cheaper than doing 46 frames per second or 32 frames per second, because film is expensive. Film is still expensive. If you get in the film industry and you want to record on actual film, on film reels, the negatives, the film, that's expensive. The process of developing it, that's expensive. The printing it, that's expensive. It takes time, it takes chemicals, it takes kind of special stuff. So film even then was expensive. And so 24 frames per second was a lot cheaper than 32 or 46 or any number that's higher than that. So 24 became kind of their standard number, and we've been using it ever since. So frame rates today, still primarily 24 frames per second in the movie business. And that's because of those decisions that were made a long time ago, but it's also because we're just so used to it. As a culture, as a society, when we go to a movie theater, we expect a certain kind of look, and that look is the look of 24 frames per second. You may not realize it because you're not thinking about it, but 24 frames per second, the way it moves, the way it pans, the way the camera moves, and the way the images happen, there's a certain kind of look, a certain kind of feeling that's reproduced only by that 24 frames per second. Anything else doesn't look like a movie. It looks like something else, like a home movie or a video camera or something like that. But when we see 24 frames per second, that's really when we start to feel like this is a Hollywood film or something like that. It's what we've grown accustomed to. There are other frame rates. We have 30 frames per second, for example. This developed out of television broadcasts. When television started to become a thing, they needed to figure out how to sync up the frame rates, how to make sure the frame rates were consistent. The same issues that the film industry was dealing with back in the late 1920s when they needed to standardize their frame rate in order to add sound. So when television was a thing, how can we sync it up? How can we make sure that the frame rates are consistent? How can we make sure that the sound matches the frame rate? And some guy, I don't know who, had this genius idea of using the electrical currents in our outlets. And our electrical currents in America run on 60 hertz. And so you take that number, you divide it by 2, you wind up with 30, and that's why we have 30 frames per second on television, or 29.97 to be exact, because it comes from the currents in our electrical system. It's also why if you go to Europe, they have different frame rates on their televisions and on their cameras, because their currents are at 50 and we're at 60. So that's where you get these different numbers from. So 30 was close enough to 24 that the television industry, the broadcast industry, was happy with that. And a lot of people didn't really tell the difference, but you can tell the difference. If you pay attention, as you guys get more and more trained at looking at this stuff, you're gonna notice the difference between what looks like video, 30 frames per second, and what looks like film, 24 frames per second, even though both might be shot on film or both might be shot on video cameras, that the frame rate gives it that distinction. Okay. We also have 60 frames per second. Your cameras will shoot at 60 frames per second if you are so inclined. Anyone have an idea what 60 frames per second could be used for? Yeah, Nick, go ahead.
Like games and stuff?
Sure. Anything that's fast moving, right? So if you're shooting, if you're doing games, you have a first person shooter or something like that, you want that detail, right? That rich movement. If you're watching sports, baseball, hockey, football, soccer, right? The ball moves quickly, right? So they'll use 60 frames per second so that you can see more detail, because the more pictures you take every second, the clearer that image is going to be. You can also do this for slow motion, right? If you have a high speed camera, if you shoot something at higher frames per second and then play it back at a normal frame rate of 24 or 30, you're going to have this really cool slow motion that looks really amazing. If you ever watch the Mythbusters, or if you ever watch the slow-mo guys on YouTube, right? They'll take these cameras that shoot thousands of frames a second, and then they play it back at a speed of 24 or 30 frames per second. And then it's all really slow. And that's how you get to see those cool explosions that last for like hours, right? And it's beautiful and it's amazing because they have so many pictures for every single second. Okay. How many of you saw The Hobbit? Anyone? Anyone? Yeah? A few people? So if you watched The Hobbit, how many of you knew that it was shot in a couple different frame rates? Ruben just asked me in the chat, why was Gemini Man shot at a higher frame rate? Well, this was done out of the director's choice. So Peter Jackson, when he did The Hobbit, had a director's choice. He decided he was going to shoot this at 48 frames per second. Did anyone see this in 48 frames per second by chance? You would have had to buy a ticket that said 48 frames per second. But when it was in theaters, when Hobbit was in theaters, you could see it in the normal 24 frames per second, or you could see it in 48 frames per second. And people are saying, well, why would I want to see it in 48 frames per second? Well, it's more pictures, right? It's more detail. It's more fluid motion, right? Because more frames means more clarity. So a lot of people went and watched The Hobbit in 48 frames per second. And a funny thing happened. A funny thing happened. A lot of people didn't like it. A lot of people didn't like it. It was more detailed. It was more rich. It was more fluid in its motion, and people didn't like it. They said, this looks weird. This looks like television. This looks low budget. This looks like a soap opera. Okay? Because as a society, as a culture, right? Film is a language, right? As a culture, we've gotten so used to 24 frames per second, that film look, that when we saw something else, we all said, no, that doesn't look right. That's not a movie. That doesn't look like a movie. That looks strange. That looks like a soap opera. It looks like television, because television has more frames per second. And we've come to associate television with lower budget work, right? Whereas film costs a ton of money, but it's usually a higher quality, a level of work. That's not always the case anymore. Okay, in the day of streaming, that is not always the case anymore, but it was always the case for a long time, right? Films were a lot more money, millions and millions of dollars, bigger budget productions, higher quality, 24 frames per second. We've come to associate 24 with that dreamy sort of film look. So I have here the Hobbit trailers. Now, I don't know if this is going to play back very well for you guys through Zoom. So it might be not worth our time to watch this. But I have two Hobbit trailers side by side. One of them is 48 frames per second, and one of them is 24 frames per second. And we're going to see if you can spot the difference. I don't know that you'll be able to do it through Zoom, but I will share these slides with you at the end of the day, so you can go back and watch these on your own time, and you'll be able to play it back and get a better idea.
My dear Frodo, you asked me once if I had told you everything there was to know about my adventures. Well, I can honestly say I have told you the truth. I may not have told you all of it.
Bilbo Baggins. I'm looking for someone to share in an adventure.
I can't just go running off into the blue. I am a Baggins.
Wait!
Of Baggin.
Bilbo, allow me to introduce Fili, Kili, Oin, Loin, Darlin, Balin, Biffa, Boffa, Bomba, Dori, Ori, and the leader of our company, Thorin Oakenshield.
Far over the misty mountains cold, to dungeons deep and caverns old, the pines were roaring on the height, the winds were moaning in the night, the fire was red, it flaming spread, the trees like torches blazed with light.
I cannot guarantee his safety,
Understood.
nor will I be responsible for his fate.
You'll have a tale or two to tell when you come back.
Can you promise that I will come back?
No. And if you do, you will not be the same.
Think about which one you think is which one's 24,
name
which one's
is
28.
Bilbo Baggins.
It's a wild guess. There you go.
What is a Baggins?
Were you right? Did you guess correctly? Could you tell the difference at all? I'm guessing you probably couldn't through Zoom. But go back and watch this when you get home in my slides. Take a look at it. See if it's something that you can notice. But this was something that Peter Jackson chose to do just because he wanted to try it out. He kind of wanted to see what 48 frames per second looked like. And there are some people that like it. A lot of younger people, a lot of people in your generation are starting to appreciate and experiment with higher frame rates and like it. People that are a little bit older, people of my generation, people that are a little bit older than me, we grew up with something different. So high frame rates usually meant low quality. And I think we're looking at it through that lens. So there's no right or wrong answer as to what frame rate you choose to use. You just need to understand why you're making that choice as a director. That's the important thing that you need to understand. So here's a great clip from Sherlock Holmes. Anyone seen Sherlock Holmes? Anybody? So Sherlock Holmes, there's this great scene where they use a high frame rate camera in order to capture the slow motion of it. So here's how that ends up looking. Oops.
Oi, we ain't done yet.
This mustn't register on an emotional level. First, distract target. Then block his blind jab. Counter with cross to left cheek. Discombobulate. Dazed, will attempt wild haymaker. Employ elbow block. And body shot. Block ferrule left. Weaken right jaw. Now fracture. Break cracked ribs. Traumatize solar plexus. Dislocate jaw entirely. Heel kick to diaphragm. In summary, ears ringing, jaw fractured, 3 ribs cracked, 4 broken, diaphragm hemorrhaging. Physical recovery, 6 weeks. Full psychological recovery, 6 months. Capacity to spit it back of head, neutralized.
Okay. So you can see in this example, they used a high frame rate, and then that's how they get that really nice fluid motion where he's punching in super slow motion and all that kind of stuff. It's really cool. It's really, really cool. So that's how that's done. Now, your cameras won't shoot a frame rate that high, but they will shoot a frame rate of 60 frames per second. And if you slow 60 frames per second down to 24, you can get some really nice slow motion effects out of your work. And that can be a lot of fun if you're looking to do that. Okay, let me go back to my slides. All right, so when you select your frame rates, okay, this is the important stuff. You need to ask yourself, how do I want it to look? What kind of a look am I going for? Okay, remember, there's no right or wrong answer, but you need to understand why you're making the choice that you are making, because you, as the director, are making this decision. Are you making a narrative film, something that's based in fiction, or are you making something that's based in reality? I would suggest, this is my suggestion, this is my philosophy, you may take it for what it's worth. I would suggest that if you're shooting something that's a work of fiction, if you're shooting something that you want to be, a story, a beginning, middle, and end with a character, a Hollywood type production, you want that movie effect. You want that Hollywood film 24 frames per second look. On the other hand, if you're shooting something that's based in reality, like a documentary or a sports broadcast or a news broadcast or a commercial or something like that, you might want to use something like 30 frames per second, because we as a culture have associated that with television, which is more based in reality than when we go to the movie theater and watch a film, right? That's my suggestion. If you're going to do some kind of slow motion effect, you're going to need a higher frame rate. Otherwise, it's not going to work. You can't really slow down 24 frames per second, because once you get down to the 5 phenomenon, once you get down to 12, you can't really slow it down anymore without it looking choppy, because it's not going to look like movement anymore. You need more frames. So know why you're selecting the frame rate that you are selecting, and be consistent. Okay, you don't want to mix up your frame rates. You don't want to shoot your first act at 30 frames per second and your second act at 24 frames per second. Okay, in this day and age, it's not going to be the end of the world, but you're going to have to adjust it in post, and a good filmmaker will be able to see that you screwed up. So stay consistent. Pick one, pick a horse, and pick one. And then if you're doing like a slow-mo shot, then do that one shot in a higher frame rate. Okay, which brings us to resolution. Resolution, and then we're going to pick up your cameras, and I'm going to show you how to change this stuff. So resolution is basically just the number of pixels that make up an image. So if you've ever looked really, really close at your screen, like super close, right? Or if you've ever, zoomed in on a photo, like in Photoshop or in a photo editing piece of software, if you've ever zoomed in really, really close, eventually you'll see a whole bunch of little squares, nothing but a whole bunch of little squares. Those are called pixels. Okay, every image, every digital image is made up of pixels. All your faces right now, if we zoomed in on them, are just little squares with different shades of color. And then when you put them all together, they make the image that is your glowing visage smiling back at me. All right. So the resolution is the number of pixels that make up that image. A standard definition, now remember, these terms were made a long time ago. A standard definition was made back before all the other resolution sizes that we have. A standard definition was made back in the day when, television was first a thing, and we came up with 640 pixels by 480 pixels. And that was a standard definition. We don't really use standard definition anymore. If you're still watching anything in standard definition, I pity your soul. High definition came out in the mid 90s or so. This is where we get 1920 by 1080, or what we all affectionately call 1080p. Okay, this is what your cameras shoot on. This is high def or high definition. This is a much, 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 much bigger pixel resolution size than our standard definition. And we now have ultra high definition, or 4K. So we've got ultra high definition. If you look at the numbers there in my slides, that's like 3 or 4 times large as high definition, right? 3,840 pixels. That's a lot. That's a lot more. Okay. Some filmmakers will even shoot at higher resolutions. There are cameras that will shoot at 5K or even 8K resolution. Why would they do that, you might ask? There's no televisions that will show that resolution size. That's ridiculous. There's no screens or monitors that are readily available at a reasonable price for people to watch those films in 8K. Well, no, there's not. But if you're a filmmaker and you shoot at 8K, when you go into editing, you can crop and cut and cut that thing up into segments and not lose a lot of quality because you shot at such a high resolution size. Okay, so if we look at this in image size, here's some examples. So that little blue box down there in the lower left-hand corner, that's standard def, standard resolution. I don't even know why we still have this resolution. Like, don't ever use this resolution. There's no point. Okay, 480 by 640. Okay, then we had DVD players, and we wanted to put widescreen movies on standard def, so we made 480 by 720. And then high def came out. Oh, wasn't that a glorious time, right? 1080p, right? You can see how much bigger that light blue square is compared to our original dark blue square. That's a big difference. When high def came out, we all noticed it right away, and we were like, wow, this looks amazing. This is really, really cool. And now we've got 4K. Look how much bigger that is, okay? That's a lot more pixels that you're getting for every single image. And this is UHD, and then this is a true 4K, which is a little bit wider. And if we were going up to 8K, that's what that would look like. So you can see just a huge, huge, huge amount of pixels to work with, which is really cool if you are a filmmaker. Technology has come a long way, and the quality of our images have come a long way. So that is pretty cool. All right, which brings us to our cameras. So let's look at them now. So why don't you take out your camera? Let's take out your camera and let's power it on. I'm going to take out my camera and I will power mine on as well. And I'll share it on my screen here in a moment so you can see what I'm looking at. All right, everybody got your camera? Go ahead and turn it on and turn the dial. There's a dial on top. Turn that dial to the one that says camera. The one that looks like a movie camera. That's the one that we're going to use. That's the only one you're ever going to use in this class. You'll use photography stuff in digital media, and you'll use different dials for that. But in this class, you only got to worry about one dial. Isn't that nice? Just turn it right to that video camera dial. If you don't have a lens on your camera, go ahead and put a lens on there now, because we're going to use that a little bit later. Okay, so here is my camera menu. You should be able to see it on your screen. I activated this by hitting the menu button on the back. It's on the left-hand side of the camera. Go ahead and click that menu button, and you should have a screen that looks exactly like mine. Exactly like mine. Now you can scroll through these different options by scrolling with the wheel on the right-hand side. There's a wheel on the right-hand side of your camera. You can use your forefinger for that. Just kind of scroll, and it will take you through these different tabs. You could also move through them by using the arrows on the back of your camera, but it's easy just to scroll. I like to scroll. Scrolling is fun. Okay, so we're going to scroll through these different little tabs, and we're just going to get stuff set up. And the one that I want you to look at right now is this second tab right here. And the first tab on this screen is movie record size. This is the important one. This is the one that you always have to set up first. Okay, this is the important one. All right, so I'm going to, on the back of the camera, there's a button that says set. So I'm going to hit the set button, and it comes up with this image. And here is where I can scroll and decide which resolution and frame rate I choose to have. Okay. So here, for example, is 1920 by 1080 at 30 FPS, 30 frames per second. And here is 1920 by 1080 at 24 frames per second. And then here is 1280 by 720 at 60 frames per second. So here's your 60 frames per second option. And then finally, you have a standard definition option of 640 by 480 pixels. Don't use this option. There's no reason to use this option. I don't even know why this option exists. Yes, Sarah, query recognized.
Sorry, I don't see the, what you're talking about. So when I hit the menu, I only see like 6 tabs, whereas I think yours had like an extra 2.
Are you on the movie camera mode?
I think so. Is that the last one on the dial?
It's the last one on the dial, yes.
I had the same problem.
You the same problem?
Yeah.
Wait.
What don't you see?
Basically, I'm on the last one, as you told us, and there's only like two reds, 2 blues, and 2 yellows. Basically 6 in total.
Okay. Okay. Go to the first tab here.
Yeah.
See where I'm on the first tab? You got the first tab?
I'm on the first tab, but mine doesn't look like that. I only have
just listen. Do you have an option that says movie exposure? I lost Tyler. If you have an option that says movie exposure, make sure you turn it to manual. That's important.
I don't have that.
You don't have that option.
I don't have that either.
So how many of you don't have this option? Well, that's interesting.
I think I actually figured something out.
Okay.
I noticed something popping up when I was turning the dial. Like it would have like the icon of the setting it was supposed to be in, but it didn't match up with what was being shown like on the dial itself.
Yes, that sounds right.
Okay.
Yeah. Because if I turn this dial, then I lose options, right?
Yeah.
So I would suggest if you're not seeing all of the tabs that I'm seeing in my mode, try turning that dial a couple times and turning it back, and then press menu and see if that works.
Works.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Everyone else?
Mm-hmm.
So dial first and then menu. Good?
I still don't see it.
Carla, you still don't see it? Did you dial first?
Yeah.
Okay, leave your menu.
Okay.
Turn it to M. All the way to M. All the way to M.
Yeah.
All the way. All the way. You on M?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then go all the way back to camera. And now hit menu.
Okay, now I see it.
Hey, success. I'm so smart. Okay, all right. So now we're all in the same place. Okay, so movie exposure. Make sure under this one, it says manual. No one needs to be under auto, okay? Auto is for rookies. Auto is for slackers. Auto is for people who can't handle real filmmaking. And we are real filmmakers in this class, okay? So make sure you change movie exposure to manual. They should already be there unless somebody reset your camera. So hopefully it's already there, but if it's not, change that to manual, okay? Then on the second tab here, there's your movie recording size. So if you haven't already done so, you need to choose a resolution and frame rate. We're not doing any slow-mo shots right now, so I'm gonna choose either 30 or 24. It's up to you. You're the director. How do you want your film to look? It's up to you to decide. I'm gonna stick on 24 right now because that's just how I'm feeling. So I'm gonna stick on 24 frames per a second. There are some other options in here. I'm not gonna go through all of them right now. We're gonna have to divide this up and I'll talk more about a few other options on Thursday. I don't wanna overwhelm you. And we still have a lot of basic settings to cover when it comes to camera stuff. So that's all I'm gonna worry about for right now. If I hit menu again, I can leave and you can actually like see my little camera screen right here, which is all blurry and out of focus for the time being. Okay. Okay. Actually, while you're here, while you're looking at these frame rates, let's just take a look at them so you can actually see the difference. So here's 24 frames per second. Let me focus on something over here so you can actually see what I'm looking at. Okay, so like here's my posters on the wall. All right, there's the movement of my posters on the wall. Okay, that's 24 frames per second. If I change it, let's see if you can tell the difference. I'm going to change it to 60 frames per second because that'll be a noticeable difference. All right. Oops. Do you see the difference? You might not be able to see it through Zoom. Try it on your own camera. Turn it to 24 frames per second in your menu. Set it, and then move your camera around. Wave your hand in front of the camera, move it around, that kind of thing. And then switch it to 60 frames per second, and then move your camera around and wave your hand in front of it and see if you can tell the difference. Yeah, Nick, what's up?
How do I delete everything on a card? Because mine's full.
I'll get to that in a little bit. Not relevant right now.
Okay.
Mine says it's like set to lock. How do I take off the lock?
That's not relevant right now. We'll get to that later.
Okay, but then I can't see anything through it.
You can see it. It just has a little thing in front of it.
Oh, I can't. Okay.
If you need to unlock it, you can take out your SD card, and there's a lock on the actual SD card. So if you remove your SD card from the camera, there's a switch on it, and you just need to flip the switch. It's on the left-hand side. It's usually yellow. Can you guys see the difference between 60 and 24? Yeah, Ruben's all about it. He gets it. Autumn's got it figured out.
The 60 is a lot smoother.
I can't hear you, Jeremy. Hang on. Try again. Did you have a question, Jeremy?
No, I was just seeing the 24 has kind of the stutter that you only really notice when you switch to the 60.
Correct. That is correct. And that's the film look that we're used to seeing, that sort of 24 frames per second. It's just a little bit almost of a stutter, just a little bit. We get more fluid motion if we had 60 frames or a different frame rate. But as a society, we're just so used to 24 and that look that we've come to appreciate that as the film look. So that's kind of what we're used to. And that's changing a little bit. You see guys like Peter Jackson filming at higher frame rates. You see some other filmmakers that are filming at higher frame rates. Maybe you want to change and film something at a different higher frame rate. Some people just don't like higher frame rates. Some people say it makes them car sick. It's like it's too much movement. Like it feels like a soap opera, or it feels like Jello, or it just feels too real, and it gives them a headache, right? So some people prefer that more, you know, that lesser degree of frame rates, something like 24. Okay, so I want to talk about now how to actually use the camera. So I'm going to go back to my slides here. And I'm going to explain kind of how cameras actually work. So back in the day, before digital cameras, you put film into the camera. If you were here in class, I would show you some old film cameras that I have lying around. But you put film into the camera, right? And then you have a lens, and the lens focuses on your subject, whatever you're shooting, right? Okay. And then light travels through that lens and then goes past a shutter. There is a door. There's a little tiny door in a film camera that opens and closes. And when it opens, it reveals the film underneath. The light hits the film, and the film develops the image that it sees because it's sensitive to light. Your digital camera works exactly the same way under the same principles, except instead of film, there's a sensor. And if you took the lens off of your camera and looked down inside your camera, you'd actually be able to see the shutter. You'd actually be able to see some mirrors. And then if you open those up, which you should not do because it's bad, but if you did, you could open it up and you could actually see the sensor of your camera. And that's when, when the sensor gets exposed to light, it captures the image. And that's how that works. So cameras are really all about getting the proper exposure, the right amount of light into the camera. This is how you become a great photographer. This is how you become great with a camera when you're trying to be a great filmmaker and you want your pictures to look nice. It's all about exposure. It's all about getting the right amount of light into the camera and hitting the sensor in the right way. That's the trick. And all cameras, whether they are film cameras or digital cameras or the like, they all rely on 3 factors to properly expose an image. And that's the shutter, the aperture, and the ISO, or what is really just the sensitivity to the light. Okay. And you can see all these numbers, all these measurements are measured on your camera in the screen. So if you are looking at your camera screen at the bottom, you see a meter that looks like this. If you look through your viewfinder, you'll see a meter that looks like this. A proper exposure is that little middle sort of triangle diamond thing in the middle of that meter. So you've got can you guys see my mouse if I move my mouse? Yeah. This right here, that's the center of your light meter. This is a light meter. This is underexposed. That's bad. That means your image is going to be too dark. This is overexposed. That's really bad. That means you're going to blow out your image and it's going to be too bright and there's nothing you can do to fix it. But this right here, that's the butter zone, baby. That's the good stuff. This means a properly exposed image. And this is what you want. So you can trust your meter here. Your meter will help you and tell you if this little line down here is down here or over here, you know that your meter is underexposed or overexposed. So to fix that, to move this little diamond to match up with this little diamond, we have to adjust the shutter, the aperture, and the ISO. And any one of these is going to have an impact on our exposure. You can adjust one of them or all of them depending on what you want and how you want your film to look. And they all affect exposure in this way. This is a nice little image. You can look at it on your own time when I share these slides with you. All right, so we're going to start from left to right. We're going to start with our shutter. The shutter is the first one that you should set when you're setting your exposure, okay? So the shutter is the first number on the left in that exposure, in that meter. So I'm going to turn on my camera again so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay. So if you see my camera here, there's a 60 on the bottom lower left-hand corner. That 60 is my shutter speed. And I can change it by moving my dial. And you may notice that when I turn my dial really high to like 3200, the image gets dark. That's because inside my camera, there is a little door that is opening and closing and letting light hit my sensor. This number that says 100 right now on my screen, this number is actually a denominator. So don't be fooled. It's actually a denominator. And it actually means 1/100th of a second. That means my shutter door is opening for 1/100th of a second. Okay? Everyone figured out how to adjust their shutter? Everyone good with that? Okay. Okay. So the faster or the slower that shutter door opens, the more or less light is going to get in and expose onto the sensor of your camera. But this also affects your motion blur. Okay? This also affects your motion blur, how much or how little motion blur you have. So, for example, everyone get out your cameras. You can follow along with me. I'll switch back to my camera. All right, get out your cameras. Put your hand in front of your camera and like focus on your hand, okay? All right, so here's my hand. And if I turn this down to 30, this is 1/30th of a second. And if I wave my hand, look at all that motion blur. Look at all that motion blur. So much motion blur. It's amazing. Now, if I ramp up that shutter speed so it's faster, 1/40th of a second, 1/50th of a second, so on and so forth, look what happens to the motion blur after a while. You see that? It disappears. So less and less and less motion blur happens over a period of time. So how much motion blur do you actually want? What is the appropriate amount of motion blur? Well, the answer to that question, here's what a shutter looks like, by the way. The answer to that question is, generally speaking, if you want natural looking motion, you take your frame rate, you multiply it by 2, and make that your denominator for your shutter speed. Okay, this is a general rule. This is just a good rule that every filmmaker follows if you want natural looking motion. So if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you multiply 24 times 2, it's 48. Your cameras don't go to 1/48th of a second, but they go to 1/50th of a second, and that's pretty darn close. So you would set your camera shutter speed to 50, and that would be a very normal looking shutter speed with a normal looking amount of motion blur. And then you wouldn't change it for the rest of your shot. You wouldn't change it at all. You just leave that alone. You lock down your shutter speed and then you move on. Okay? If you were shooting at 60 frames per second, you would multiply 60 by 2 and get 120. And you'd want to get a shutter speed that matches as close to 120 in the denominator that you possibly can. So your cameras would go to 125th of a second, I think. Okay? But the idea is to set that shutter speed and to leave it alone and not touch it after that. Okay? Unless you want to be a little creative, unless you want to do something a little bit different. Okay? So when would you not want natural looking motion? I mean, most of the time you're going to want natural looking motion blur, right? But when would you maybe not want natural looking motion blur? Anybody? Yeah, Carly, go ahead.
Like maybe if you're trying to show that someone's hallucinating or like drunk or something, and you're showing from their perspective.
Totally. Yeah, like let's say maybe you got like a dream sequence or something like that, right? like a creepy Alice in Wonderland sort of dream sequence, right? Okay, maybe that would be a good way to like to make that shutter speed really slow so everything blurs together a little bit. And then it feels like they're a little out of it. Maybe they're, you know, maybe they're half asleep, or maybe they're dreaming, or maybe they're out of their head because they're had some kind of substance or something like that, right? So that could be a useful tool to visually show the story and the feeling that's taking place. Okay. Anything else? Any other ideas when we would not want a natural looking shutter speed? Jeremy?
Maybe, yeah, for something like sports or something, you want like it to be really fast so you can see it with very little time.
Okay, all right. So if we want more detail, maybe you want to make the shutter speed a little bit faster. Okay, good call. Good call. A fast shutter speed, you know, something that's really, really quick is going to create that sort of strobing sensation, right? Like when we were waving our hand in front of our cameras and the motion blur disappears and it starts to strobe. You've probably seen this if you go in like a haunted house at Halloween, right? And they have the strobe lights going on and everyone walks around and the zombies are walking around and it looks creepy, right? It looks crazy. Like it's scary. There's a reason why it looks scary. It's because there's no motion blur. And it's unsettling. It's unnatural. And that's why they put strobe lights in haunted houses. Okay? This is also why whenever you watch a horror movie, they crank up the shutter speed when the people are being attacked by the zombies or the aliens or the monsters in the closet. Right? So-and-so's sneaking up behind Autumn and we can see the guy who's going to stab Autumn in the back, and they go into this whole death scene, right? Of Autumn getting stabbed. Sorry, Autumn, you didn't make it. I'm sorry. It's sad. It's monsters going to eat you alive. Okay. But during this whole battle, right? Okay. They're going to crank up the shutter speed and get that strobing effect because it looks creepy. It looks eerie. It looks wrong. And this is the idea of film, guys. This is what separates filmmakers from home movie people. Okay. You want to use the technology. You want to use the cameras to visually showcase the story or the feeling or the emotion that you want your audience to have. Great filmmakers are great manipulators. I mean this in a good way. When we go to see a film, we want to be manipulated, right? We're paying good money to feel something, right? And a good filmmaker knows how to do that. They can use the visual elements of the story to make you, the audience member, feel a certain way in a certain moment. Okay, so when you're being attacked by the zombie and it's all strobe lights and everything like that, and it feels unsettling, all of a sudden you feel unsettled. You feel scared. You feel like the character in that movie. And that's awesome. And that's filmmaking, is getting the audience to be part of the movie that they're actually watching. The question is, if you put up the shutter speed, do you have to increase the frame rate? The answer is set your frame rate, lock your frame rate, and then set your shutter speed to have the appropriate amount of motion blur that you want in correspondence with your frame rate. So you don't change the frame rate because of the shutter speed. You change the shutter speed because of the frame rate. If you want it to be natural, you take the frame rate, you multiply it by 2. If you don't want it to be natural, then you have some more freedom to play around with. Does that answer your question? Cool. Solid. Okay. This effect, by the way, was done very, very famously in Saving Private Ryan. If any of you have seen Saving Private Ryan, very, very famous film, Tom Hanks, there is this great scene where they're on the beach. And when they get to the beach, the filmmakers play around with the shutter speed. They increased it and they decreased it. They went up, they went down. They had a whole lot of fun with the shutter speed because they wanted you to feel like Tom Hanks feels in this particular movie. So I'm going to put this on and we'll see if this is a little graphic, by the way. If any of you have seen Saving Private Ryan, you probably know the scene I'm talking about. If you're uncomfortable with a little bit of blood and guts, maybe this is one you look away from, okay? Pay close attention. Do you see the lack of motion blur in that camera movement right there? You can see this is unsettling. Okay? Because they want you to feel unsettled in this particular moment. No motion blur going on. And Tom Hanks is totally out of it. Look, you can see every droplet, every little bit of water, every little bit of exploding dirt. And again, the idea is the filmmakers want you to feel what Tom Hanks is feeling. Well, how is Tom Hanks feeling? Feeling overwhelmed, right? He's literally overwhelmed with everything that's happening. It's too much data. So you can see every drop, every detail. It's information overload. People are talking at him, and he can't even hear what's going on because it's shell shock. And then he snaps out of it, and then they start taking the shutter down a little bit. You can still see every single one of those little water droplets and all that kind of stuff. So a very famous scene in which they played with the shutter speed for a certain effect. They wanted you to feel what Tom Hanks is feeling. And again, this is filmmaking, is getting the audience to feel how the character is feeling, getting them to empathize, getting them to feel as if they were that character in the movie. This is what separates like Oscar-winning film directors versus like regular old schmoes who are just filming whatever, right? Is getting your audience to connect with that character, because the story is the most important thing. Okay, moving along. I only got 10 minutes left, so I got to hustle. All right, so aperture. Aperture is the next thing that we can adjust in our camera. This is basically just adjusting the size of the hole in the lens itself. If you have a larger hole in the lens, more light's going to get in. If you have a smaller hole in the lens, less light's going to get in. That's pretty simple, but it also adjusts some other things that we can have a lot of fun in. Aperture is measured in f-stop. The f-stop is the number that we see on the camera. The thing that you need to understand is that if the number is small, if it's a small f-stop, that means it's a large opening. Okay? That's what that means. A nice large opening. So a small f-stop, large opening. So if I go to my camera here, well, there you go. You can see right there. There's an aperture getting larger and then getting smaller. That's a large f-stop, and that is a small f-stop. Okay. The cool thing about aperture, the thing that makes it the fun one, this is the fun one. This is the one that you want to play around with the most. The reason why this is the fun one is because this affects how blurry the background is from your subject. This is what gives you that really cool cinematic look. So right now, if you're looking at my screen, I'm all in focus. I look great. Optimus Prime behind me is out of focus. And that's because I have a shallow depth of field. Shallow, like if you're diving into water, right? Shallow depth of field. I cannot see very well behind me. Optimus Prime is out of focus. If I was to get out of the shot, my camera will focus on him, and then you can see Optimus Prime in my bookshelf, my very messy bookshelf. And then if I come back, eventually it'll find my face. Now, the reason it looks this way, the reason it looks cool is because I have a small f-stop. Okay, my f-stop right now is at like 2.8 or something like that. Okay, now if I changed my f-stop to be like 10, you could see me in focus and you could see Optimus Prime in focus. Okay, I'm not going to do that because that is not what I want, but I have the ability to do that as a filmmaker, and so do you. So to do that, get out your camera. So here's my camera, and I'm going to focus on my hand here. I'm using the wrong lens for this, but that's okay. So there's my hand. Okay. Now, if I want to adjust my aperture, the way to do it is there is a button on the back of your camera that says AV. You hold down the AV button and then turn your dial. And then you'll see those numbers start to change. And if I have a high number, my hand and the background will be more in focus. And if I have a low number, the background will blur more and my hand will stay in focus if my hand actually is in focus, but we're not in focus right now. So. There we go. So play around with that, see how that works. Hold down the AV button and turn your dial. Now you'll notice my camera is getting lighter and darker as I do it. That's because there's less light getting into the sensor when the whole of my aperture becomes smaller. Everyone get comfortable with that? Okay. Now this is really, really cool. This is what gives you that nice cinematic look because you can have a lot of fun with this. So for example, if we go back to Autumn, who's still being murdered by the monster in her closet. Sorry, Autumn, this is like a ridiculously long murder sequence. This is really hard for you. Okay. So if the monster is still stabbing away endlessly at Autumn and Autumn is screaming and blood is gushing everywhere and all this kind of stuff, right? Okay. If we want to sell that, if we want to make that seem like scary as we see the monster behind her get closer and closer, I want to see the monster in focus, but I also want to see Autumn in focus, right? That makes it terrifying because, oh, Autumn, there's a monster behind you, right? But if I made it all blurry, if everything behind Autumn is blurry, I don't really see the monster and then the suspense is gone. Or maybe you've got like somebody who's visiting, you see this one in movies all the time. You see someone who's visiting New York City for the first time and it's exciting. And they go out into downtown New York and they look around and they can see everything, right? They want everything in focus because it's big and it's huge and it's overwhelming and it's amazing. And they want you, the audience, to feel that sensation of seeing everything at once and how big it is, right? Or maybe you've got, you know, two lovers, you know, back from war, right? So we've got, you know, the person coming back from war and they meet their long lost love and they go into the big city and they're finally together and they hold each other in a warm embrace and they kiss and you're going to do that cool thing where you do like the 360 camera move around them and all that kind of stuff, right? In this moment, you don't want the background to be in focus. You don't want anything in focus except for just this couple, right? Because they're the only people that matters. And they're not paying attention to anything around them in the world. And you want your audience to feel what they are feeling. So you make the whole city blurry and you only focus on those two people and their special moment because that's all that matters, right? So this is an artistic choice that you have control over as a filmmaker. Now, when you make these choices, more or less light is going to get into your camera. So you have to make other choices to accommodate to get the right exposure. That's where the exposure triangle comes in. So review that again later in your downtime when you get a chance, because making adjustments to this to get the creative shot that you want is going to impact the amount of light going in. If you're outside on a hot day and the sun is bright, you're gonna have too much light. You need to figure out a way to stop the light. Maybe go stand in the shade. If you're shooting in a dark room and you want that big depth of field so I can see the monster coming up behind Autumn and it's dark, it's gonna be too dark. And how am I going to get more light into the camera? You might need to open a window. You might need to turn on some lights. Okay, you need to make other adjustments to your camera. Okay. Which brings us to our last and final aspect of the exposure triangle, and that is, oh, there's depth of field for you. There's a nice image, by the way. So there's a nice low f-stop. And there's a nice high f-stop. And you can see the difference that it makes. And one's not better than the other. It's just what you want for that particular shot as a director for your film. Okay, which brings us finally to ISO. I'm going to go through this very quickly because we're almost out of time. But ISO stands for International Organization of Standardization. This was just a group of people that made the algorithm that is ISO. This is carried over from film camera days in which we called it film speed, or how sensitive the film was to light. So basically, if you had a fast piece of film, then your ISO was high and it would get exposed very, very quickly. And if you had a slow piece of film, it would take longer for it to get exposed. And that was a slow film. You can still buy film and they'll have these numbers on it. If you go buy like old school film somewhere, they'll have the film speed on it. This is your ISO, basically. So your cameras work the same way, even though they're digital. What you need to know is the higher ISO you have, the more sensitive your camera is to light. So if you need more light in your camera, you can add kind of like artificial light. You can add light sensitivity to your sensor, okay? And that's the way that works. And that can be great, except you need to understand this one very important principle, and that is the more sensitive your sensor is, the more noise will be in your camera. And noise is bad. Noise looks gross. You do not want camera noise, digital camera noise in your image. I'm not talking about sound. I'm talking about visual camera noise. It's gross and you do not want it. Generally speaking, the higher your ISO is, the more camera noise you will have. So generally you want to keep the ISO as low as possible. There is something called native ISO. Different cameras have different numbers that work really, really well for them. But for your cameras, the important thing that you need to know is that you just don't want to go over 800. If you go over 800, your image is going to look like garbage. Just don't do it. Don't do it. And keep it as low as you possibly can, because you will notice it if you have to add a lot of digital noise. So for example, I don't have time to show you this video. You can watch it later when I share the slides. This is digital noise. This is what digital noise looks like on your cameras. This is the exact same camera that you have. If you bumped your ISO up that high, you would have that amount of digital noise over whatever you were trying to shoot. And that's gross. You do not want that. Do not put that in your image because that is garbage. All right, we're ending now, so I will sum up with this. The DSLR, guys, these cameras are awesome. The DSLRs are a total and complete game changer in the film industry. Nikon offered the first one that shot at 24 frames per second, and Canon shortly followed with one that shot in full high definition. These were game changers. When I was in college, not that long ago, to get a camera that shot on 24 frames per second, true 24 frames per second, you had to spend thousands for this. Thousands and thousands of dollars. You have one in your hand that when it was new was like $600. Like, it's so readily available. It's really cool that you have the ability to shoot high definition 24 frames per second with interchangeable lenses. This was an absolute game changer in the industry. So much so that professionals have been using DSLR cameras for film shoots all the time ever since it took off. So here was a short that somebody shot when the Canon first came out that could shoot 24 frames per second. And it was done sort of as a proof of concept. And Canon helped pay for it, I think. And everyone, all these filmmakers were like, whoa, this is amazing. And all of a sudden you had shows there you go, like House. Anyone watch House? Anyone ever see House? Okay, House very famously shot, I think it was their season 6 season finale on Canon DSLR cameras because they could. And everyone was like, whoa, this is amazing. And it's super cool. So you have amazing technology that's available to you to use. So you guys are really lucky to have the kind of technology that you have, because I didn't have it when I was your age, that's for sure. Okay, I will be sharing these slides with you at the end of in just a little bit. There are videos in here that I did not have time to show that help reiterate these concepts and these ideas. So if you want to review, your assignment for Wednesday is to review this material because I know it's a lot at once. So I'm going to share with you these slides so you have an opportunity to look at them again. There are videos within the slides that you can watch for helpful review. There is this video that you see the thumbnail for right now, which is basically me going through the camera settings of your camera. So if you want to review that with me again, you can do it through my video. I have also recorded this entire lesson and I will be posting it online. So if you want to review this entire lesson again in its glory and in its entirety, it will be posted on my YouTube channel. Don't tell my teachers union I'm not supposed to do that. Okay, all right. So that will be there for you to use as a resource. There are other videos up there as well if you feel like looking ahead at, you know, senior year or whatever. I actually record a lot of lessons so that if you're ever absent or sick, you can kind of look and see what's going on. But that is all for today. You did have an assignment. I've changed it because we didn't have time. There is not an assignment for you to do other than just review this material on Wednesday. On Thursday, please have your batteries charged again because we'll do a few more things on the camera, and then we're going to talk about different types of camera shots, and then I'll introduce the assignments you have to do after that, which you can do over the weekend and won't be due until like Monday or so. But thank you. I kept you 3 minutes late today. I apologize. But remember that the next time I let you out early. Have a great day. I will see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.